Hello, everyone. My name is John Degen, and I am chair of the International Authors Forum and executive director of the Writers Union of Canada. I'm pleased to welcome you to this discussion about copyright exceptions and limitations balanced by licensing, the final discussion in a series stemming from the IAF's recent Creating a Living report, which you can find on the IAF website. Let me remind you that this talk is being recorded and streamed live on Facebook as well. If you have questions for the panelists, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom screen. I want to start by acknowledging that my home in Canada is in Tekaronto, a Mohawk word which translates to where the trees meet the water, or the gathering place. Tekaronto is bound by Dish with One Spoon, a treaty between the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee to share the territory, promote peace, and protect the land. And I am very, very grateful to have a home here. So we have a bit of a time constraint today because, as it happens, two of our panelists, myself included, will very soon be appearing before a Canadian Parliamentary Committee to discuss, well, copyright exceptions and limitations balanced by licensing. So the same topic we're doing here today. So I will jump straight to introductions. We're joined today by José Borghino, who has been Secretary General of the International Publishers Association in Geneva since September 2015. José leads the IPA team at World Intellectual Property Organization's SCCR meetings. Ruth Simujayangombe is the Chief Executive Officer of the Zambian Reproduction Rights Organization, a role she's held since 2015. Ruth has a Bachelor of Laws degree and is admitted to the Zambian bar as an advocate. Carol Newman is the General Manager of the Jamaican RRO Jam Copy, which she has been leading since the agency started operations back in 1999. Carol is also the Executive Director of Carosa, the agency established by Caribbean RROs to license cross-border use and reuse of copyright content in the Caribbean. And finally, Roanne Levy is CEO and President of Access Copyright in Canada. I work very closely with Roanne and know her as an outspoken champion of creators' rights. She is leading Canada's copyright licensing agency in bold new directions and toward new service offerings. So we'll go in the same order and we'll just have opening statements from everyone. So José, over to you.
I'll unmute. Thank you, John. I'll jump straight in. The International Publishers Association, or IPA, is the world's largest federation of national, regional, and specialist book publishers associations. Established in 1896, our membership comprises 86 organizations from 71 countries around the world. Copyright advocacy is one of the IPA's two main policy pillars, the other being freedom to publish. This is because copyright is an essential foundation for publishing. It's copyright that enables publishers to produce, distribute, and promote books in physical and digital formats for the benefit of readers. Without copyright, publishers would not be able to sustain and recoup the investments they make in publishing literary works or educational works or any works, because they would not be able to sell and license those works. We advocate an appropriate set of exclusive rights that enables physical sales and digital licensing that must not be affected by overbroad and unjustified exceptions and limitations. Appropriate enforcement laws are also important, and regulations to enable publishers to defend their copyrights against infringement, which has devastating impacts, especially on digital publishing. Specifically on exceptions and limitations discussions at WIPO, exceptions and limitations are being discussed at the SCCR as a solution to accessing copyright works. The first response to access is provided by a vast array of licensing solutions made available by publishers for all types of users. Publishers understand the needs of their different audiences, including libraries, archives, and educational institutions, and work to address those needs. This has not changed due to the COVID-19 pandemic. On the contrary, publishers responded quickly to provide licensing solutions tailored to the needs of users. In addition, STM publishers immediately made COVID-related research content available for free. In many countries, educational publishers also provided schools and students with free access to educational platforms and materials for the time necessary for educational authorities to adapt sustainable solutions. Excuse me. Despite the discussions at SCCR, despite all that, discussions at SCCR seek an international harmonisation. The needs of cultural and educational institutions, however, are national and not international. The educational ecosystem is a complex local environment involving schools, teachers, national curricula, policymakers, students, parents, and educational publishers. It is deeply rooted at a national level. Educational policies are defined in every member state differently, from curricula to textbooks. High quality educational content must be produced for each country according to its specific needs. Basically, publishers are the financial engines of the copyright machine. They pay advances to authors offset against future royalties to give them the security and time to write. They pay editors, illustrators, typesetters, and designers for their work before a single copy of a book is printed and available in the marketplace. They pay printers and app or web designers and marketers long before a book has been distributed or displayed. They negotiate a cut of a book's retail price with bookshops, websites, and aggregators before anyone has bought a copy. In short, they take the financial and reputational risk of investing in a commodity that they believe in and they hope will be loved or useful or both, and therefore bought by readers. Authors and content creators can also be described in terms of risk. They risk their time and reputation whenever they sit down to create. They are willing to devote years of their lives to creating an object or narrative that no one has ever experienced before, the final form of which they usually only dimly intuit at the moment they embark on its creation. Authors and creators risk poverty and obscurity. Publishers risk going bust. Copyright is the basis of a complex and delicate ecosystem, not a license to print money. The threats to copyright from pirates and thieves, from free riders wanting ever more exceptions to copyright law, from deluded governments believing that they can produce high quality educational textbooks, are slowly but surely spoiling that ecosystem. Authors entertain us, educate us, and are society's moral conscience. They are the way we tell ourselves who we are, what we've done, and what we could be. They chronicle, inspire, and admonish us. Copyright is the mechanism our society has invented for ensuring that authors are rewarded for their creativity and are encouraged to continue creating. In an increasingly globalized, digitized, and mediated world, authors are the people who create an intelligible conversation out of the anarchy, dissonance, and babble. And publishers are the engine that drives that conversation, ensuring that it reaches its maximum audience. People talk about the knowledge economy or the ideas economy of the future. The future is now. Today's authors are the creators of the ideas that will inspire our future dreams. And publishers are the people who make those ethereal, evanescent ideas tangible and real. Copyright has an ethical dimension, but it is not a religion. It's just a tool, a way of monetizing an author's investment of time and a publisher's risk capital. It may not be a perfect instrument, but it is the best we have by a long shot. Exceptions and limitations complicate the copyright ecosystem, but they will never generate works or more works. In fact, an overabundance of exceptions and limitations will diminish the number of high quality titles. Thank you.
Thank you, Jose. And as we move on now to hear about copyright licensing, the other side of this discussion, I just want to mention that our partner for this presentation today is IFRO, the International Federation of Reproductive Rights Organizations. So thank you very much to them. So Ruth in Zambia, can you give us your perspective?
Thank you, John. as we all know, copyright, like any other IPRs, is founded on providing protection for the creators and also while creating a balance for the users. The essence of this has always been because there's no way rights holders can only create for users to benefit while they are not recouping a benefit from what they create. And ordinarily, when we look at the nature of copyright, it gives the rights holders, whenever they create their works, an exclusive right to be able to control people or to make use of their works. But I think we should never forget that the exceptions and limitations that are in the various legislations that we have are there to create a balance between what the rights holders will have created and how the users can access those works. And to be more practical, I mean, we are able to see in terms of exceptions and limitations that we've got quite a number of exceptions and limitations that allow for use of works in a way such that we cannot say that copyright is what impedes information sharing, and it is the reason why there is less access. Because when you look at most of these copyright legislations, more particularly our Zambian Act, it does provide for access to content. Yes, we have the exceptions and limitations which limit how much somebody can do with the copyright works. But we have, for instance, deliberate sections in the legislation that give more access. For example, libraries are allowed to be able to create a work outside the normal way in which exploitation can be done, to be able to create more access for any other users. Apart from that, we also have the legislation covering private use. For example, if somebody has to access those works for private use. And then moving on to educational purposes, our legislation, like many other legislations, does provide for the limitations under which one can make those reproductions and that kind of access, and even research. However, the law does not only end there, it goes on further to create a system that allows for licensing, which the licensing that is there, what it does is it creates further access more than what is there if you are going to consume that particular work in its traditional way of going into a bookstore or something like that. When we're talking about books, for example, where you have to buy that particular work. The law provides for there to be licensing solutions, which is through ourselves as an RRO and as a part of the IFRO community. And what you find there is that those licensing solutions are helping people to be able to access those works more. And also it creates a balance where such we can not only have the legislation limiting you of the things that you're able to do. It creates a solution for you if you want further access to be able to make copies and things like that. If you feel the information sharing going by the traditional way in which the legislation has been set, there is the licensing solution. However, we cannot emphasize that it's only through exceptions and limitations and widening them that is when we will be able to achieve being able to access works. We have not yet, and most of the countries, I mean, Zambia is one of them. Yes, we do have that legislation, but we have not explored the licensing options that we have. So demanding to say we should have further exceptions and limitations that are wider is the solution to information sharing, I think is overemphasizing something that is not of an urgent need right now. Going further, the Berne Convention does talk about various legislation being able to be drawn from the provisions that it has. And we cannot overemphasize the fact that the whole world needs to have wider exceptions and limitations because each and every country has got various needs in terms of access. So therefore, we cannot overemphasize that the only solution and the only way we can be able to achieve wider access to content is through widening exceptions and limitations. And speaking from the region where I come from, and particularly the country that I come from, it's all about culture as well. We cannot say only when we have wider exceptions is when we could have people accessing works more and being able to share information. That is like opening a Pandora's box. Right now, we are grappling with lots of people being unable to publish because our publishing industry is dead. We're able to continue having lots of works being consumed. We're consuming foreign works because our publishing industry is not thriving. And the reason it is not thriving is because we are not remunerating the rights holders who have already created adequately and in a manner that allows them to keep on creating. So widening exceptions and limitations does not only kill the creators not being able to get their incentives, but it also kills the notion of attaining certain pronunciations that are made. For example, being able to provide quality education. You cannot provide quality education when you do not have the necessary content. And that content can only come about when you are able to incentivize the rights holders, and the rights holders then will have continuity in terms of production. So my take, and I always think and say and seem to lean more on being able to balance the two, in as much as we want wider exceptions and limitations. I think before we rush into wider exceptions and limitations, what we need to do is to explore the licensing options that are available. And quickly to speak on the world's current state right now, where we have the COVID pandemic, the IFRO community, Zambia inclusive, has been very proactive in that manner. And copyright has been one of the ways and the reasons there's been abilities for educational institutions, for example, to access works away from their usual traditional environments, which is classroom. And the IFRO community has been able to respond even during COVID times. And therefore, even right now, we cannot overemphasize that what we need are exceptions and limitations because there's COVID and because copyright does not make provision for that. The licensing systems that we have in place have been able to take care of that. Even through that, so many organizations, so many RROs have been able to give guidance on how to create further, how to be able to access the content during the COVID pandemic. So I think copyright has still been able to help with creating further access and ensuring that there's continuity in terms of access to content and sharing of information even during the COVID pandemic. Thanks, John.
Thank you, Ruth. And thanks to both you and Jose for mentioning, and really stressing how flexible licensing has been during COVID. We've had a very similar experience here in Canada, which I'm sure Rowani will touch on. But first, let's go to Carol Newman in Jamaica and the perspective from your organization.
Thank you, John, and good morning, everybody. Copyright lies at the heart of publishing, as has been alluded to by the previous speakers. With this economic model for rewarding creativity, copyright law is designed to facilitate development of the creative industries and ultimately national and cultural development. But I hasten to add that if the tenets are not respected, creativity and growth will be stymied, primary publishing markets will be undermined, and any potential for wealth creation and economic development will be threatened. The contribution by publishing to national development, however, is not only as an economic undertaking, but, and perhaps more importantly for small creative states like the one I'm from, Jamaica, publishing's contribution is as a cultural enterprise. Publishing plays a vital role in educating, informing, and shaping the worldview of the nation's human resources. Books and other printed materials are the bedrock of literacy and numeracy, providing the gateway to the acquisition of knowledge and the development of the skills and abilities of the population. The current international legal framework for copyright has built-in public interest considerations for accessing published copyright materials. Copyright legislation of countries like Jamaica, I submit, are flexible and responsive to the needs of users, such as libraries, education and research, museums, and archives, through a variety of nationally tailored exceptions and limitations, combined with licensing solutions made available through collective licensing agencies when accessing and using content, both nationally and across borders. These collective licensing solutions are a means to an end, a vibrant and successful local creative community and publishing industry. Jamaica is a model example where both users and rights holders avail themselves of collective licensing and the built-in flexibilities of the copyright system. The 20-plus-year-old collective management organization, that is JamCopy, has successfully provided licensing solutions to education and research institutions, libraries, and government. Jamaican institutions offering tertiary education, whether through face-to-face or online classrooms, operate under a license from JamCopy. In fact, even in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic, the government of Jamaica only last month signed a copyright license for public schools in Jamaica. And I hasten to add that JamCopy has been negotiating with the government for almost as long as it has been in existence. So this emphasizes the how licensing arrangements can and do provide the access that is needed. So just last month, as I said, the Jamaican government signed the licensing agreement for the use of copyright materials in schools and K-12, in the K-12 level. And these licenses allow for analog as well as digital uses and provide access to works published in over 40 countries around the world. One demonstration of the flexibility of which I speak is the fact that in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, JamCopy, as did other members of the IFRA community, expanded its licensing limits without requiring users to pay additional fees. Licensing also provides flexible solutions for cross-border uses. For example, multi-campus universities. IFRA members all over the world are developing solutions such as multi-territory licenses that include foreign campuses in the main national license, or regional licenses for universities that operate in many different countries. Again, this is very evident in the Caribbean, where there are 5 reproduction rights organizations: JamCopy in Jamaica, the TTRRO in Trinidad and Tobago, BCopy in Barbados, BECLA in Belize, and ECLA for the OECS member states. All 5 Caribbean RROs have collaborated to establish the entity CAROSA to provide cross-border licensing solutions. Through CAROSA, a flexible and efficient single regional license was offered to the regional university, the University of the West Indies. Through this single licensing solution, staff and enrolled students of the UE, no matter where in the world they are, would be covered under this license. As an optimal response, I therefore submit, is a mix of full exploitation of the existing exceptions for minor uses that exist in the current legislation, collective management for more expansive uses, and encouraging the development of a vibrant local publishing industry to build the primary market. This can be complemented by encouraging increased use of the Copyright Tribunal, where users query licensing tariffs set by local CMOs, and having established regulation for CMOs where they exist, and also encouraging where there are no CMOs to encourage the establishment and building the capacities of those institutions. These elements, working side by side, can address the concerns of users such as libraries, education and research, museums and archives, when accessing and using content both nationally and across borders. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carol. That's a fascinating point that about CAROSA, that CMOs working together can create a very sort of flexible solution for a region. Roanne, tell me what's going on in Canada. I think I know, but
so unfortunately, I have the pleasure still to address the attendance to provide a warning sign, a kind of a canary in the coal mine is what Canada is, a sign of what not to do, truly. So for Access Copyright has been working and licensing the reuse of content for over 30 years. So we're in many ways a mature RRO. And for over 20 years, it worked well. It provided access to content in such a seamless way that teachers, professors, and students didn't even know how it was cleared. Like they just assumed it was like, air, water coming out of the tap. They just knew it was going to be there. And the collective solution provided the access and also rewarded the creators and publishers for the use of the work. And it was a thriving writing and publishing ecosystem, one that Canada was very, very proud of. So what happened? In 2012, an exception was introduced in Canada's Copyright Act, a broad, poorly defined exception. It's referred to as fair dealing for education. So it all pivots on the concept of fairness, which of course is in the eyes of the beholder. The writing and publishing sector, when the exception was being introduced, warned that this had the potential to be very detrimental to the writing and publishing ecosystem, that we would impact, of course, the licensing revenue, but also primary sales, that the exception would substitute for the purchasing of content. The education sector went before the legislative committee and said the opposite. They said, no, this was just for that odd time where it's very difficult to clear the right, that they would not stop paying the collective license, that it would not harm writers and publishers. Unfortunately, what happened was exactly what we predicted would happen. So now we're almost 10 years out. We've had litigation. We're still in litigation. We've had a complete breakdown of the market. It is no longer one that one can be proud of. The educational publishing market is not thriving in Canada, quite the contrary. So as predicted, primary sales have gone down as a result of massive and systematic copying without compensation. The royalties from Access Copyright has significantly declined. They've reduced by almost 80% since the introduction of the exception, so since 2012. Investments have declined in educational publishing and in books generally. Just from numbers that comes from Statistics Canada, our national statistics gathering body. Sales to educational institutions of books have declined since 2012, so since the introduction of the exception, by 43% once adjusted for investment. And these are, feel like just data points, numbers, but speaking to publishers, they will confirm that their sales have declined by 40, 50, 60%. And of course, that is not sustainable. We've seen publishers exit the market completely or stop their publishing program for elementary, secondary, of course, with a loss of content, with a loss of tailored content to the Canadian reality, to the Canadian, telling Canadian stories to Canadian students. That is a significant, significant loss. And of course, there's hardship to authors as the revenues have significantly declined. The royalties from Access Copyright have historically been 20% of a writer's income. That's a lot to lose. And for publishers, the royalties from Access Copyright have historically been 16% of the profit line, 16% of the profit line. So when you think of those numbers, and then you hear about the exit of publishers, job losses. We've had significant job losses in the book industry. It's not surprising that this has happened. The courts, as I mentioned, we've been in litigation almost 10 years. The courts have said that what is happening is not fair. that it is having significant impact on writers and publishers, that it is substituting for the purchases of books, and yet we're still in this ongoing litigation and conflict with the education sector with no end in sight. So really a huge, huge warning sign. It may seem like a very alluring, enticing way to provide access to content to students, but the exact opposite happens. There's no real cost savings to the students, and there's yet a huge loss in content to the students and the society at large, in addition to the suffering and the harm caused to the writers and publishers, the national writers and publishers. So that's really the warning side. In the end, everybody loses. The only people that win is like this small group of copyright lawyers, because they've done good business for 10 years and probably for a few more years to come.
Thank you, Roannie. And I know the Canadian situation very well, obviously. You mentioned that the copyright royalties were traditionally about 20% of an author's income. Our organization, the Writers Union of Canada, has been tracking those losses, and 20% may not sound like a lot. It's certainly not 100%, but that can be the difference between an author deciding to stay in the business or not deciding to stay in the business. So in a lot of ways, the damage that is caused by something like the situation that you've outlined is almost unmeasurable, because how do you measure authors who have left, and how do you measure the number of books that they might have contributed to the national culture had they not left? So that was excellent introduction from everybody. We're going to move to sort of a general discussion, and I want to remind anybody who's watching on Zoom that you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask questions of the panelists. But I've been making some furious notes as we've been going along. And Jose, you mentioned the value chain that publishers deal with before a book is even published. We run into a lot of problems, a lot of demands for more and more exceptions, and I'm wondering if a lot of that demand comes because those costs that you mentioned are kind of invisible. Is there some way that we can make people better understand that this is a real business and that creative content is not free?
Yeah, look, the magical thinking that goes into a lot of the copyleft's ideas of expanding or broadening exceptions and limitations comes, I think, from that misunderstanding. There's a view in most people's heads that publishers sit around in an office and a genius author rocks up and sends them a manuscript via email, and they send it off to the printers, and that's it. The money comes in. The truth is that publishing is a very complex field, whether it's trade or whether it's education or STM. In trade, for instance, out of every 10 books, 2 break even, 2 do well, and the rest are losses. So the publisher has to weigh up those numbers, has to, in effect, put aside money and try to make as many bestsellers pay for the titles that don't break even or even make a loss. So I think the only way that we can let people know about it is to continue talking about it, continue to tell people that this is the case. For many centuries, publishers have kept this arcane system to themselves in an effort not to look like losers, I suppose. Nowadays, it's time to let people know that the business models that publishers operate under or with depend on copyright to the extent that publishing may not happen the way that we've grown accustomed to, and that the business models of our main rivals are completely different. Their business models entail taking other people's creations, not paying for them, and distributing them for free to gather information about readers' private lives to sell to advertisers. So I think there has to be a lot of demystification, but on both sides. And I think that's happening. I think in many ways we've reached peak platform, if you like, and people are now beginning to question the saintlyhood of some of the big behemoths in California and elsewhere. So I'm confident, I'm very optimistic that that in the end, sense will come out on top.
Peak platform. I like that expression. I'm always amazed how certain business models just do not have compensation for the creative content as part of the mix from the very beginning, and obviously that has to change. I was struck by both Ruth and Carol's point that licensing is actually a very important tool for building and protecting a national culture. Just how damaging can a situation like Canada be to you in Zambia, Ruth, or you in Jamaica, Carol?
Well, certainly, speaking for Jamaica, where we have a small publishing industry, the widening of exceptions and limitations can only be the death knell for an indigenous publishing industry like ours, where there are no subsidies given to the creative industry, certainly to the publishing industry. And how then would small publishing houses survive? The current situation in Jamaica, for example, is that government does provide some amount of resources for education at the primary and secondary levels, the K-12 sector. But the publishing industry, the small publishers that exist, have to be the ones to invest in the resources. Also, the authors, we don't have full-time authors in Jamaica because they can't afford, they can't afford to be full-time authors. And so authors would love to be able to concentrate on writing full-time. It's just not been possible. Can you then imagine what would happen if the exceptions and limitations are widened? And so there is even a further erosion in the income received by authors. Then there'll be certainly no incentive at all to write. Now they would like to feel that they're incentivized and that they would want to write and record our stories more, but they're simply not able to because of the current situation. Mm-hmm. So if it is that these the revenue stream, the incentives to be able to write are gone, then I fear that will be the end of our local publishing industry. And then speaking for the wider Caribbean, already there are some countries where there are no publishers, and most of the authors do self-publishing. And so again, if they're not incentivized, what would be the basis for continuing to write and record our stories?
Thank you. And Ruth, I imagine you're in a similar situation in Zambia, sort of absolutely essential part of the mix for that culture building exercise.
John, it actually is so disheartening to think about the current situation right now, even where we have these licensing provisions being provided for under the legislation. I will give you a practical example. Our biggest, it used to be our biggest publishing house, the Zambia Education Publishing House, which, well, then when it was vibrant, it served Zambia in terms of the literacy sector, and much of the works that were being used in schools I learned from that curriculum, and most of those works were actually created by that publishing house. But it is a sad story to speak of right now because the publishing house is almost non-existent. But to think of a publishing house that has served the nation, and when you go around, you still find the works being consumed. There's a lot of it still in the curriculum, very relevant. It's content that has helped Zambia in terms of speaking about culture and everything, because much of the content that it had to generate was based on who we are as a nation, as a country. Now, to think of being in a situation like Canada, and then where if the world gets to decide that we must going towards widening exceptions and limitations, when even right now, most of our rights holders, our writers, what they have mostly are manuscripts. They cannot publish their works because, like José said, once that ecosystem is broken, you cannot have even that content that you want to widen the exceptions and limitations for. So you discover that if we do not find, if we keep on insisting on wanting to have works for free, when we already have examples, I mean, I will talk about Zambia as an example right now, where we have almost non-existent publishing houses. The ones that are doing fine are publishing houses, obviously, that are privately owned. And of course, they're not being subsidized by anybody. And so if they completely do not get that incentive that they're supposed to get away from the traditional cells, where they should be incentivized for any use of their works that is beyond their normal channels where they can get their remuneration through that system, then we will be killing this industry. And I think even sitting here preaching widening exceptions and limitations will be nothing, because what will you access when you widen those exceptions and limitations when you don't have the content? So it is such a sad story. I mean, right now, as we're speaking, before we get to speaking of the future in a manner that we widen exceptions and limitations and the effects become adverse, I think we already have practical examples that demonstrate to us that lack of incentivizing rights holders will only lead us not to even have that content at all.
Exactly. Thank you very much. We do have an excellent question here in the Q&A, and Rowanny, I'm going to throw this one over to you. So it says, so very sorry to hear about the situation in Canada. What can other RROs do to prevent or avoid a similar situation in their territory?
Okay, well, thank you for that question. And I think it comes back to something that I was going to also say in response to what Ruth and Carol have outlined. Often when you listen to the limitation and exception debate, it feels like a he said, she said, right? You've got the writers and publishers on the one side and what everything they say sounds right. And then you have the education sector on the other side, and everything they say seems sensible. And it's like, wow, how do you choose who's right, who's wrong? What's interesting is that in Canada, I guess one useful thing that has happened is that through the litigation, when you go to court, it's not what you can't just say things. You actually have to prove them, right? It's all based on evidence and proven evidence. And so the litigation against York University, which was all had to do with these copying guidelines that they introduced, which are essentially the equivalent of the licenses, the collective licenses that we have in place and that most ROs have in their own jurisdiction. The court spent 4 weeks, okay, 6 hours a day for 4 weeks, listening to evidence. Mostly 90% was on whether or not using what we license for free under fair dealing guidelines is fair. 4 weeks. And so with that, the court had to come to some sense of what kind of impact does this have on writers and publishers? What's the impact on the production of new works? What's the impact on sales? And the court unequivocally concluded, that it was not fair and that it was damaging to the writing and publishing sector. Of course, nobody or few people have 4 weeks to study the he said, she said. and to, you know, take it apart and try to get into the details. Well, they say they use open access content. Is that true? Or that they've already paid for it. Is that true? Very few people have the time to do that and spend so much time. So it's useful to get to take from the learnings of what happened in the York case. In terms of what you can do in your country, I think what Jose has outlined about the symbiotic nature of the relationships between writing and publishing and education, about what it takes to write a book, to publish a book, the investment that goes in it, and what is lost when it doesn't happen needs to happen more forcefully and needs to happen not on opposite sides of a courtroom or of a panel, but really as partners with the education sector. And to the extent that ROs are in jurisdictions where the relationship is one of partnership, I would invest in reinforcing that relationship by increasing the awareness and understanding of what goes in and the contributions that writers and publishers do to the education system itself.
Thank you, Roannie. You've given me all sorts of flashbacks to all that time in court. And believe me, for anybody listening from another country, you don't want all of this to end up in court. It is much easier to have a respectful balance the way we've been describing here today. And we have Carol back. Thank you. That's marvelous. I thought we had lost our connection there. So as I mentioned from the outset, we have a bit of a time constraint today, so we're going to go to closing statements, and I'll ask you to try to be as concise as possible and get it in under a minute. The one thing I want to say that my takeaway point from all of this is something that Ruth said off the outset, which is that licensing, rather than interrupting access, actually creates access. And I think that's a very, very important point that we have to repeat over and over again. So let's go in the same order, and we'll go with Jose for closing statement.
Thanks, John. I think what I want to say is what I was ending up saying at the beginning of my first attempt. Exceptions and limitations in the end will not produce any more content than we have. It will diminish the amount of content that we have. Exceptions and limitations are part of the Berne Convention. They were introduced to make sure that there was a balance, a fair balance between users and producers. But what has been happening for the last few years, in fact, is that it's more like the death of 1,000 cuts. A little bit here and a little bit there. Okay, one exception over here and another exception over there that don't seem to be connected, but lo and behold, they suddenly get connected and you get this mega exception, which cuts back on the business model of publishers and the income of writers. And that can't go on forever. There has to be a limit to it, especially and ironically in the area of education publishing, where education publishers don't have somewhere else to go. They have one market, usually a national market, that they have invested enormously in. And they can't just go away. There's no other planet for them to go to. So until I think people understand that more clearly, and until we move away from this negative situation for everybody, I think we'll just have to keep on fighting the good fight. Thank
you, Jose. Ruth, final statement.
Thank you, John. I think almost pretty much everything that I would have loved to speak about exceptions and limitations, I have said this afternoon, but I would love to sum it up by saying everything else that we would love to achieve through widening exceptions and limitations, we can achieve when we explore fully and to the greater extent licensing solutions. Because when I look at what are the benefits of licensing solutions and looking at countries around the world where they have been able to adhere to the good principles, the rights holders have been incentivized, the good that comes out of licensing outweighs what we would love to say is what comes with widening exceptions and limitations. In the end, I would still say the same thing that I would have said yesterday and over. We need to create a balance between usage and creation, because you can only use that which has been created. So when that balance is not there, the creator will never create, and licensing comes in to balance the two aspects, which is creating and using. And so far, we do have a lot of places and a lot of countries that have shown us that it is possible for us to achieve that. I am glad because Zambia is headed in that direction, and the Attorney General recently put a stop to it and has advised that licensing is the way to go for any wider access to content that is being created, and not widening the exceptions and limitations. Thank you.
That is indeed a positive note. Thank you for that, Ruth. Carol, in Jamaica, final thoughts?
Thank you, John. I end where I started, from the perspective of someone from a small island state, which where culture and creativity is what is central to who we are. And to say that Indigenous publishing plays such a unique role in helping a nation to generate, record, and disseminate knowledge and information about its own culture for the development of its people. Indigenous publishing activity facilitates the emergence of gifted local authors by providing an outlet for the dissemination of their works. They help us explore our collective experience as a people and provide valuable insights into our unique identity and culture. They help us to understand who we are and to develop a sense of identity. And with this identity awareness comes cultural confidence, and with cultural confidence comes cultural creativity, the very thing the rest of the world identifies with a country like Jamaica. And so these two areas of identity consciousness and cultural confidence are of vital importance to us in a country like Jamaica and a region like the Caribbean. Without this sense of unique identity, cultural awareness, and cultural confidence, we will not be able to achieve true development, which must come from within, which is what copyright is all about, our intellectual creativity. And publishing plays a very vital role in this process. So we must seek to encourage and facilitate Indigenous cultural industries like publishing. We must therefore, and I caution us, be very careful, I caution the policymakers, we must be very careful not to encourage, support, or take any action that will negatively impact developing publishing industries. And instead, it is imperative that we develop and implement public policies which encourage and facilitate Indigenous publishing, and which recognize our authors and publishers as important stakeholders in the education of the nation and in the development of our cultural and identity consciousness. We should also strengthen the collaboration with local publishing industry and RROs to promote respect for copyright and compliance with the copyright legislation, so that creators can be compensated for their intellectual property and we can all continue to benefit from their creativity.
Thank you, Carol. Wonderful balance of caution and encouragement there. Rowani, you and I are leaving this meeting to go to the Canadian Parliament to make this argument once again. Do you have some final thoughts as we head in that direction?
Yeah, I would invite everybody to take heed of the Canadian experience. What's interesting on this panel in particular is that Canada is, if you like, a rich country where we actually had a vibrant writing and publishing sector where access was not a problem for 20 years. The license was in place, access was seamless, it was all working well. And then we threw in exceptions. And in a country where, paying $2.41 or $14.31 at the post-sec level should not be such a hardship on anyone. And the publishing industry starts breaking down. The one thing I will kind of remind, like another, I saw in one of the questions, somebody asking for a little bit more facts on what's happened to the publishers. Back in 2012, there was about 5 publishers that did the lion's share of K-12 elementary, secondary textbooks in Canada. So the Canadian elementary, secondary, there were about 5 of them. Today, there are only 2 left. And it wouldn't surprise me if by the end of the year, there was only 1 left. So less competition, higher prices, less diversity, less content. This is not the direction anybody would want to go in. So again, reach out to me if you want more of the facts. They've been proven in court if you'd like. Be happy to share them with anybody.
Thank you so much, Roannie, and thank you to everyone on the panel. This has really been a fascinating discussion and so necessary. So thank you, everyone who joined us in the audience here on Zoom and on Facebook Live. I'd like to thank IFRO, our partners on this, and of course the International Authors Federation, the sign behind me, forum. If you want to see the other discussions that have taken place around the Creating a Living report, you can go to the IAF website, and they're all, you'll find a video link to all of them there. So I'm afraid that we do have to run because there is more of this exact same business to deal with today. But thank you all and goodbye.